What I want to talk about in this presentation are the four essences of Jesus that are presented in the four Gospels. Just to describe what's going on here, taking your first look at it, what I have here on the left is the year 30. So this is kind of a timeline from the year 30 to 90. JC here on the left, around the year 30. So that's a representation of when Jesus, the Christ, would have been executed, right? And so we have Mark here around the year 60, Matthew and Luke somewhere around 80 to 85, and then John we have over here in the 90s. So that's what we're looking at here. And one of the things that a lot of people really kind of struggle with in this in an intro to the Newer Testament is really wrapping their heads around the fact that there are four distinct essences of Jesus that are presented in the Gospels. A lot of people like to say that they're really just four slightly different versions of this guy Jesus. And I think it's actually a little bit more distinct than that. And that in and of itself can be difficult for people to be open to considering. And therefore really difficult to kind of grasp. But as with every other thing that we talk about in this course, we're going for the mark of an educated mind, and we're going for just trying to better understand what's going on in these writings in the Newer Testament. So we need to start with Mark, and one of the tricky things about this whole conversation, I'm going to put something up here in front of my face, is the fact that the Gospels themselves, right, starting around 60 to 65. The Gospels themselves are all written after the genuine letters of Paul have been written, right? So I'm going to do a little bit of something here in the middle and block the vision of me, but that's okay because I'm not important. So the tricky thing here is we have this guy, Jesus. He lives. He has a particular life story. He has a particular mission, we might say, that is described more fully in the Synoptic Gospels, if you might recall, than in the Gospel of John. But then we have this guy, Paul, who comes along and has a few things to say about and interpreting Jesus's life. And remember in the assignment on salvation in Paul's letters, right? That's part of the reason I had you do that assignment, is to have you look at and think about what Paul is actually saying is really just focusing on one element of Jesus's story, which is the execution and the resurrection. Right? So Paul's letters interpret that particular event. And then, after Paul has made these claims, we get the Gospels. So, for instance, what we have to deal with here is the fact that Jesus was a Jew, right? Jesus came along. It doesn't look like a Messiah from the typical Jewish perspective, right? This is one of the things we do talk about in class. That Ehrman talks about. And I don't know how much I push you to think about it, but a Messiah from a Jewish perspective is going to be a guy who's going to be a ruler, a king, a warrior, maybe even a priest, but someone who is bringing about those promises to Abraham, if you recall those, right? So is that what Jesus does? Does Jesus actually help people, the Jewish people, get Rome off their backs in the first century? No, he doesn't. There's a reason why most Jews in the first century did not see Jesus as the Messiah, as their Messiah, the one they were looking for to bring about the promises to Abraham. So what Paul does in bringing in all these Greek and Roman ideas to talk about this event, right, he essentially redefines, he brings in an entirely new definition of the Messiah and is using it within this sect of Judaism that ultimately, not until the year 125, right, is separate from the rest of Judaism. So there are a lot of thoughts that I'm trying to invite you to consider in the mix here, right? So by the time we get to the very first gospel that's being written, what we saw being described, right, in Mark's essence of Jesus is that Jesus was somewhat of a misunderstood. Let's see if I can write this on here without crowding everything else. Misunderstood Son of God. And that whole conversation about the messianic secret and trying to make sense of all these bizarre, why would people who know about Jesus as Son of God, why would Jesus silence them? If you remember that from the Gospel of Mark. But if you take that idea within the framework of Judaism, Jesus being the Messiah is not what Jews were looking for. You have to see that through this lens of what Paul brings into the conversation. So he's a different kind. And that's why you see in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus essentially telling people to keep it quiet. Keep it quiet. Okay, I'm the Son of God, but don't tell anyone. Because I'm a different kind. I'm not the one that you were expecting. And that's ultimately the way pastors who attend to these things, and scholars really kind of come down on the reason we have that messianic secret. He's a different kind of Messiah than what the Jews expected. Okay, so we have that depiction, but then we give it another 20 years or so, and we have Matthew's depiction. I'm going to do Matthew way over here. And if you recall, what we talked about with Matthew is that Jesus is depicted as a very Jewish Messiah. And so if you take a moment to think about this in context, right, in conjunction with Mark's saying he's a Messiah that Jews didn't expect. Matthew's saying, no, he really is the Jewish Messiah. There are all kinds of conversations we could have about that, but I just want you to think about this kind of almost tension. Because the way that Matthew proves that, if you recall, is he quotes all these passages from the Hebrew Bible. He quotes prophets, and he quotes from the Psalms, and he quotes from all different passages, right? To prove that the things that were said before in Jesus' own tradition are now also happening here in Jesus' story. So, why isn't it a Messiah Jews expected? And he's just not. So it's an interesting element in the mixture that we have Jesus is a different kind of a Son of God, and then Jesus is actually the Jewish Messiah. So then we come to Luke's gospel, and we have Luke's gospel where he is depicted as the Savior of the world. I'm going to write that over here. If you can, I know it's not quite large enough, but you get the idea. Savior of the world. And this is where people usually say, oh, well, of course, I've always thought of Jesus that way. But in the context of this development of thought, right? Initially, Jesus is a Jew, and he's a misunderstood Son of God. Then Jesus is being depicted as the Jewish Messiah. Now, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is depicted as here for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. And in the first century, this is a development of thought, right? This is very much akin to what Paul depicts in his letters, right? Is that Jesus is actually here, for the whole wide world, if you will. But that's why I tend to focus on and did the recorded those passages for you and offered the commentary to help see kind of the different nature of what Luke's depiction of Jesus is, right? All three of the synoptic gospels, if you recall, are much more focused on the human person of Jesus. And we get that very distinctly in Luke's gospel, that Jesus is here for the poor and for the widows, the orphans, significant focus on economic issues here in Luke's gospel. So we get these three different depictions of what's most central to who Jesus is in the synoptic gospels. And then, of course, we get the depiction of Jesus in John, which is he is, I can't remember the summation that we use, that Ehrman uses. I'm not sure that he even uses one in his text, but he is the man sent from heaven, right? Man sent, that's going to be outside my framework. Man sent from heaven. And we use this man in kind of the capital M when we're talking about the Son of Man, right? And again, in first century context, there's a difference between a son of God and a son of man, right? The Son of God is a human being who's chosen by God to do something special. Son of Man is a divine being who is living in some sort of spiritual realm and visits earth, right? With a mission, and then returns to earth. And that's what we see over and over in John's gospel, the language of above and below, and Jesus is from above and he's returning to above, and the earth is about earthly things and those kinds of things. So we do absolutely get the very, very, very divine Jesus in John's gospel. But notice that it takes a good 6 decades for that idea to develop. We don't have that Jesus is God here in Mark or in Matthew or in Luke, but we absolutely have it here in John. Even on that basis of the synoptics focusing on the human and the John focusing on divine, right? It's worth pointing out or reminding you that we do have very different depictions of Jesus in these Gospels. And one might want to sit down and consider whether Mark and Matthew and Luke even make sense together. Are they mutually exclusive? Is there some overlap in these? I don't think you necessarily need to come down on one way or the other on that, but I think it's worth thinking about. So I hope that covers at least a little bit of clarifying where the essences of Jesus, what they are, and how they kind of play off of each other and build really off of each other in this at the end of the first century of this Christian era.